For much of the 20th century, global institutions occupied a central place in international politics. They were not perfect, they were not neutral, but they were considered necessary. After the Second World War, the United States played a decisive role in creating many of the institutions that still shape global governance today. These organizations were designed to manage conflict, coordinate cooperation, and reduce uncertainty in a fragmented world. They reflected a belief that stability could be institutionalized. For Washington, this system served multiple purposes. It extended American influence without constant use of force. It aligned allies around shared rules, and it provided mechanisms to manage disputes before they escalated. Participation in global institutions became synonymous with leadership, not because the United States controlled every outcome, but because it helped define the framework within which outcomes were negotiated. Over time, this institutional architecture became familiar. Treaties, agencies, councils, their presence felt permanent. But permanence, in international politics, is rarely guaranteed. Part 2. How institutions became part of American power. For decades, American power was not expressed only through military strength or economic size. It was embedded in rules. Trade regimes shaped markets. Security institutions structured alliances. Multilateral forums set norms that others adapted to. This system magnified influence. It allowed the United States to shape global behavior indirectly through standards, procedures, and expectations. Crucially, this arrangement reduced friction. Disagreements were filtered through institutions. Competition was moderated by process. Legitimacy flowed from participation. Even when outcomes favored American interests, they appeared less unilateral. That perception mattered. Institutions did not eliminate power politics. They managed it. And for a long time, this balance worked. Part 3. When confidence in the system began to erode. Over time, confidence in global institutions began to weaken. Not everywhere, not all at once, but gradually. Criticism emerged from different directions. Some argued that institutions were inefficient. Others claimed they were biased. Still others questioned whether they reflected current realities. Within the United States, these critiques gained traction. Institutions that once symbolized leadership increasingly appeared as constraints. They limited flexibility. They slowed decision-making. They imposed obligations without guaranteeing results. For a country accustomed to decisive action, this friction became more visible. The issue was not rejection of cooperation. It was frustration with process. And frustration, when repeated, reshapes policy. Part 4. Why withdrawal started to feel like an option. As dissatisfaction grew, withdrawal became thinkable, not necessarily permanent withdrawal, not total disengagement, but selective distance. Stepping back from certain commitments appeared to offer advantages: freedom of action, reduced obligations, greater leverage. From this perspective, institutions no longer looked like amplifiers of power. They looked like limits. This shift did not happen in isolation. It coincided with domestic debates over sovereignty, cost, and accountability. Participation in global institutions became a political issue rather than a strategic assumption. That change altered the calculus. When participation becomes conditional, so does leadership. Part 5. When criticism turned into policy. For years, dissatisfaction with global institutions remained largely rhetorical. Politicians criticized inefficiency, commentators questioned relevance, voters expressed skepticism, but rhetoric alone does not change policy. What changed was repetition. As criticism accumulated, it began shaping concrete decisions. Participation was no longer treated as automatic. Funding became conditional. Commitments were re-examined. This marked a turning point. Institutions that once functioned as default platforms for cooperation became optional tools. This shift altered how decisions were framed. Instead of asking how institutions could be improved, policymakers increasingly asked whether engagement was worth the cost. The burden of justification reversed. Institutions now had to prove value to the United States, rather than the United States proving commitment to the system. That reversal mattered, because systems built on shared responsibility weaken when one actor begins measuring engagement transactionally. Part 6. How funding became a lever. One of the most visible mechanisms of disengagement was funding. Financial contributions had always been part of institutional influence, but they now became instruments of pressure. Support was delayed, budgets were reduced, contributions were linked to compliance. From a domestic perspective, this approach appeared pragmatic. Why fund organizations perceived as inefficient, biased, or misaligned with national priorities? From an international perspective, however, the signal was different. It suggested conditional commitment. Conditional funding reshapes behavior. Organizations adjust priorities. Programs slow or stall. Internal planning becomes uncertain. Even when funding is restored, the interruption leaves a mark. Reliability is questioned, and reliability is the foundation of institutional trust. Over time, funding leverage altered relationships. Institutions became cautious. Negotiations hardened. Consensus became harder to reach. The system did not collapse, but it lost momentum. Part 7. When multilateralism felt like a constraint. As disengagement progressed, a deeper critique emerged. Multilateralism itself came under scrutiny. Institutions require compromise. They prioritize process. They distribute influence. For a country accustomed to shaping outcomes directly, this can feel limiting. Decisions take longer, outcomes dilute preferences, responsibility becomes shared. In this context, institutions no longer appeared as force multipliers. They appeared as constraints. This perception gained traction as global competition intensified. Rival powers were seen as exploiting institutions without respecting their spirit. Rules were followed selectively. Norms were interpreted strategically. Enforcement appeared uneven. For critics, this reinforced skepticism. Why remain bound by systems others manipulate? The result was a growing preference for flexibility, bilateral agreements, ad hoc coalitions, issue-specific arrangements. These alternatives offered speed and control, but they sacrificed legitimacy and durability. Part 8. How specific institutions were affected. The impact of this shift was not uniform. Some institutions felt it more acutely than others. Organizations dependent on consensus struggled as engagement declined. Agencies reliant on stable funding faced operational uncertainty. Forums designed for long-term coordination lost momentum. In some cases, withdrawal was symbolic. In others, it was practical. Programs were scaled back. Commitments were suspended. Participation became selective. Each action, taken individually, appeared manageable. Together, they signaled a pattern. That pattern reshaped expectations. Partners began preparing for gaps. Institutions adjusted to unpredictability. Alternative frameworks gained appeal. The system adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. Part 9. How allies responded to American distance. For allies, American disengagement created a dilemma. Global institutions had long served as anchors of coordination. They reduced friction among partners. They provided shared reference points. They stabilized expectations. As the United States stepped back, allies faced choices: follow, compensate, or adapt independently. Most chose adaptation. They increased coordination among themselves. They sought continuity where possible. They avoided confrontation. But concern grew. If institutions weakened, coordination costs would rise. If rules fragmented, predictability would decline. Allies understood that institutional erosion rarely stops at one participant. Part 10. How rivals interpreted the shift. Rival powers observed American disengagement closely, not as a retreat from global affairs, but as a redefinition of engagement. In some cases, disengagement created openings, vacancies were filled, influence expanded, norms were reshaped. This did not require overt confrontation, it required presence. Where American participation declined, others stepped in. Funding gaps were addressed, leadership roles were assumed, agendas shifted incrementally. The result was not immediate transformation, it was gradual rebalancing. This process reinforced a central reality. Institutions reflect participation. When engagement wanes, influence follows. Part 11. When disengagement created feedback loops. As disengagement progressed, it generated feedback effects. Institutions weakened, coordination suffered. Outcomes became less favorable. These outcomes then reinforced skepticism. Why invest in systems that deliver less? The logic became circular. Disengagement reduced effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness justified further disengagement. Breaking that cycle became increasingly difficult. This dynamic explains why withdrawal often accelerates. Once participation becomes conditional, restoring full engagement requires political effort. And political effort depends on perceived benefit. When benefits are diffuse and long-term, commitment erodes. By this stage, pulling back was no longer about dissatisfaction alone. It was about inertia. The system adapted to distance, and adaptation reduced urgency for return. Part 12. How disengagement reshaped the global system. When the United States began pulling back from global institutions, the effects were not immediate. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic rupture. Instead, the system absorbed the change slowly. Institutions continued to operate, meetings were held, statements were issued. From the outside, the architecture remained intact, but internally, the balance had shifted. Global institutions are not static structures, they are living systems. They function through participation, credibility, and expectation. When a central actor reduces engagement, the system adapts, not by stopping, but by reconfiguring. That reconfiguration became visible over time. Decision-making slowed. Consensus became harder to achieve. Agendas expanded without clear prioritization. This was not because institutions became incompetent. It was because coordination became more complex. Part 13. When rules lost their center of gravity. Rules derive strength from enforcement, and enforcement depends on legitimacy. For decades, American participation provided both. Even when rules were contested, their application carried weight. But as disengagement increased, enforcement weakened. Not universally, but selectively. Some rules continued to function, others became negotiable. Interpretation replaced obligation. Compliance became strategic rather than automatic. This created asymmetry. Countries followed rules when convenient and challenged them when costly. The absence of consistent enforcement did not eliminate norms. It blurred them. This blurring had consequences. Disputes became harder to resolve. Arbitration lost authority. Outcomes depended more on leverage than procedure. In effect, power politics crept back into spaces once managed institutionally. Part 14. How Allies Filled the Vacuum. American disengagement did not leave institutions empty. It created space. Allies moved to fill it, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively. European states increased coordination within their own frameworks. Regional organizations gained prominence. Leadership roles rotated more actively. This diversification was not inherently destabilizing. In some cases, it strengthened resilience, but it also fragmented authority. Instead of a clear center, influence dispersed. Decision-making became decentralized. This diffusion altered incentives. Coordination costs rose. Negotiation timelines lengthened. Compromise became more fragile. Allies adapted pragmatically. They focused on continuity, but continuity without leadership has limits. Eventually, questions emerged. Who sets priorities? Who absorbs costs? Who enforces outcomes? Without clear answers, institutions drifted. Part 15. How rivals capitalized on institutional fatigue. Rival powers did not challenge institutions directly. They participated. They attended meetings. They funded programs. They proposed initiatives. But they also reshaped norms subtly. Where enforcement weakened, interpretation expanded. Rules were applied selectively. Language was reframed. Standards were negotiated downward. This approach avoided confrontation while altering substance. Influence expanded not through dominance, but through persistence. Vacant leadership roles were assumed. Funding gaps were filled strategically. Agenda setting shifted incrementally. Each change appeared technical. Together, they accumulated. This strategy proved effective precisely because it was quiet. There was no trigger for resistance, no clear violation, just gradual adjustment. Part 16. When global cooperation became transactional. As institutions weakened, cooperation changed character. Long-term commitments gave way to short-term bargains. Issue-specific coalitions replaced standing frameworks. Participation became conditional. This transactional logic altered behavior. Countries invested where returns were immediate. They disengaged where benefits were diffuse. This approach favors flexibility, but it undermines stability. Institutions exist to manage uncertainty over time. When cooperation becomes transactional, uncertainty increases, planning horizons shorten, trust erodes. The system did not collapse, but it lost coherence. Part 17. How smaller states experienced the shift. For smaller and mid-sized states, the impact was profound. Institutions had provided insulation. Rules reduced vulnerability. Process limited exposure to raw power. As institutional authority weakened, these protections eroded. Smaller states faced tougher choices. Align with regional powers. Hedge across multiple partners. Accept higher risk. Their margins narrowed. Their dependence increased. The system became less forgiving. This dynamic deepened inequality within the global order. Those with leverage adapted. Those without absorbed costs. Institutions once mitigated this imbalance. Disengagement amplified it. Part 18. When uncertainty replaced stability. Over time, uncertainty became the defining feature of the system. Not chaos, uncertainty. Rules still existed, but their application varied. Commitments still mattered, but their reliability was questioned. Leadership still existed, but it was situational. Uncertainty alters behavior. It encourages hedging. It discourages long-term investment. It rewards opportunism. In this environment, cooperation becomes harder to sustain. The system entered a phase of constant adjustment, always reacting, rarely consolidating. That state is manageable in the short term. It is exhausting in the long term. Part 19. Why returning to the old system is unlikely. Some argue that disengagement is temporary, that the system will reset, that leadership will return. History suggests otherwise. Once institutions adapt to reduced engagement, reversal is difficult. New actors fill roles. New expectations form. New norms emerge. Returning requires not only political will but structural change. The system no longer waits, it moves. And moving systems resist reversal. This does not mean American influence disappears. It changes form. It becomes episodic rather than structural. Power is exercised through moments, not frameworks. That shift is profound. Part 20. What this means for global power. The withdrawal from institutions reshapes power itself. Influence becomes more fragmented. Authority becomes negotiated. Leadership becomes conditional. In such a system, strength alone is insufficient. Power must be exercised repeatedly. Trust must be rebuilt continuously. Stability becomes provisional. This environment favors adaptability, but it punishes complacency. Countries that fail to engage consistently lose influence quickly. Those that remain present, even quietly, shape outcomes. Part 21. Why this phase matters more than it appears. This is not a transitional moment, it is a structural shift. The rules of engagement are changing. Institutions no longer guarantee stability, they require maintenance. The question is not whether global institutions will survive, they will. The question is how effective they will be and who will shape them. Disengagement is not neutral. It redistributes influence, and redistribution reshapes order. Part 22. What comes after withdrawal? When countries pull back from global institutions, the immediate focus is often on what is lost: influence, coordination, legitimacy. But the deeper question is what replaces them. Withdrawal does not create a vacuum. It creates a transition, and transitions shape systems for decades. For the United States, pulling back does not mean disengaging from the world. It means engaging differently, less through standing institutions, more through selective involvement, less through permanent commitments, more through episodic action. This approach offers flexibility, but flexibility has trade-offs. Part 23. How policymakers frame the next phase. From Washington's perspective, distance from global institutions is often framed as realism, a correction rather than a retreat. Institutions are seen as tools, useful in some contexts, limiting in others. This framing emphasizes sovereignty, efficiency, and control. But institutions were never only about efficiency, they were about predictability. They reduced the number of variables decision-makers had to manage. Without them, policy becomes more reactive, more dependent on personalities, timing, and leverage. This places greater strain on leadership. Every engagement becomes a negotiation. Every absence becomes a signal. Part 24. Why selective engagement is hard to sustain. Selective engagement sounds practical. In reality, it is demanding. It requires constant attention, continuous recalibration, frequent reassurance. Institutions absorb effort. Without them, effort must be supplied manually. This increases the burden on diplomacy. Allies expect clarity. Partners seek consistency. Rivals test boundaries. In a system without strong institutional anchors, signals must be managed carefully. Misinterpretation becomes more likely. Over time, selective engagement risks becoming uneven engagement, and uneven engagement erodes trust. Part 25. How allies adapt to a more conditional system. Allies do not wait for clarity. They adapt. In a world where participation fluctuates, allies build redundancy. They diversify partnerships. They strengthen regional mechanisms. They invest in autonomy. These steps reduce vulnerability, but they also reduce dependence. As dependence declines, influence changes. Leadership becomes negotiated. Alignment becomes situational. The system shifts from hierarchy to network. This transformation is not inherently unstable, but it requires adjustment. Expectations must realign. Roles must be renegotiated. Part 26. The long-term risks of institutional erosion. The erosion of institutions rarely produces immediate crisis. Its risks are cumulative. Coordination failures increase. Disputes linger unresolved. Crisis management becomes harder. Institutions exist to handle stress. When they weaken, stress transfers to bilateral relationships. That transfer increases friction, and friction accumulates. Over time, the system becomes more brittle. It functions until it doesn't. Part 27. Why return is more difficult than exit. Leaving institutions is often easier than returning. Exit requires decision. Return requires consensus. Institutions evolve. They adapt to absence. They redistribute influence. When a central actor seeks to re-engage, the system may no longer look familiar. Rules may have changed. Norms may have shifted. Expectations may have hardened. Re-entry becomes negotiation, not restoration. This reality complicates future policy. Disengagement creates path dependence. Choices made today constrain options tomorrow. Part 28. What history suggests about this moment. History shows that global orders change slowly, then suddenly. Institutions erode quietly. Influence diffuses gradually. Then a crisis reveals what has been lost. The post-World War II system was built to prevent that. Its institutions were designed to absorb shocks before they became ruptures. Pulling back weakens that buffer. This does not guarantee instability, but it increases exposure. Part 29. The question that remains open. The question is not whether global institutions will survive. They will. The question is who will shape them. Influence flows to those who remain present, who attend meetings, who fund programs, who set agendas. Absence does not stop institutions from evolving. It only changes who leads that evolution. Part 30. When power becomes a choice, not a given. In the institutional era, power was structural. It flowed automatically. In a post-institutional environment, power must be exercised repeatedly. It becomes a choice, a decision renewed over time. That shift places greater responsibility on leadership. Consistency matters more than strength. Presence matters more than rhetoric. The future of global cooperation will not be decided by declarations. It will be shaped by participation, by who shows up, by who stays.